This video is talking about the evolution of technology for FUE or follicular unit excision. I'm talking really about the instrumentation. To me, the instrumentation is incredibly important, but the person doing or using the instrumentation is equally important. I liken it to driving a Ferrari. If you're driving an F1 car, or whatever it may be, it doesn't have to be, it could be a McLaren or a Mercedes. I don't follow F1 every day, so I don't know exactly which team is leading what. But if you think about F1, it's predicated on a lot of factors. One, it's predicated on the quality of the car and the engineering. It's also predicated on who is driving the car. And it's also predicated on the team that is with the team of engineers, the team of people working on the pit crew. And that's really very similar in a way to FUE. So FUE, so before we even talk about instrumentation, I want to do a brief introduction to the concept of who's driving the car. That's me. So, in a lot of places out there, especially, for example, in Turkey or elsewhere, there are no physicians, or a lot of my colleagues are not even using physicians. They're just using whoever walks in the door without even necessarily a high school degree, that are just basically going to be, they were taught on a weekend course how to harvest. But it's so important, as you heard in my other videos, in terms of donor preservation, because if you destroy that donor, no matter how good the instrumentation you use, you're not going to have anything usable for the future. It's completely destroyed. So it's important to every single graft that's harvested, I'm making a conscious decision. Should I harvest this? Should I not harvest this? So the driver of the car is so important. The car itself is so critical. If I'm using antiquated devices that don't work well, I can do okay, but with the best machine, I can do great. I watched this special, or this documentary on Michael Schumacher. As you know, he's now paralyzed, unfortunately, from a ski accident, but during his glory days in the 90s, he was driving for Ferrari, and Ferrari was actually really bad because the cars just were underperforming. But he was able to outperform in rain and still win the F1 races because of his skill as a driver. So clearly, he still lost the cup until the engineering of Ferrari got better. The point of this is that I can still do pretty well with bad technology, but why should I do that? Because with the best technology, I can perform the best. And then the team. The team is not doing the harvesting. I don't have people doing harvesting. I'm the driver. But they're telling me, they're giving me feedback. With every harvest I make, they're calling out, hey, transection, or I need more tissue, or the quality here is not as good. I'm getting constant feedback. From the corner of my eye, I'm actually looking at every graft that I'm harvesting, seeing the quality as well, so I can feel the quality. Believe it or not, as I'm harvesting, I actually can feel if the quality is good, but I'm also getting feedback from my staff telling me, hey, this is good, this is not so good, you're transecting here. And so that feedback from my team is so important. They're also sorting grafts, they're also trimming grafts, they're also making sure we don't over trim grafts, because FUE grafts by their very nature are more fragile. They're making sure the grafts are stored and always hydrated. If you leave the grafts out for 3 minutes, they're dead. Not barely survived, they're dead. This has been shown. So the idea of all these components are very, very important. But the one point that I wanted to talk about now and focus on is the car, the Ferrari or the McLaren, which is the instrumentation. I've talked about the role of that instrumentation within the context of the team, so I don't want to overemphasize that the technology is everything, but the technology is critical. I've written the only book in the world on FUE. Now, there is a book out there with 3 chapters or 4 chapters. My book is 60 chapters, so this is a massive book. My first book that came out in 2015-16 only had about a third of the number of chapters, and it only is about 500 pages. My new one is about 1,600 pages. My first book came out in 2015-16, and my new book came out in 2022. So you say, that's 6 years difference between one book and the other. Why did you spend so many years going back and redoing it? And the simple answer is, in 2017, there was a big revolution in technology. So before we talk about what that landmark year was, I want to sort of give you an evolution of where FUE started, how it came about. So first, back in the 1970s, the technology was really basically big punches. They were 4-millimeter punches. That's actually how hair transplant started. In the 1950s up to the 70s, they were large punches that took out 16 to 20 hairs, 3 to 4 follicular units. If you don't know what a follicular unit is, they're basically clusters of hairs that grow in 1, 2, and 3 fours. And these big punches is what led to what we call plugs. So the term pluggy or plug-like were these large grafts that just looked bizarre. We call them doll's hair as well. We realized that was the issue, and so basically grafting moved over to linear strip excision, also known as FUT, which is erroneously called that, or follicular unit transplant. But the grafts became smaller and smaller. They were dissected. Those 4mm punches were first cut into quarters, which were called micro and mini grafts. And then finally, the Bobby Limmer back in the late 80s came up with stereomicroscopic dissection of a strip incision, and that became fine grafts. There's a saying in French, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, which basically means more that changes, more the same thing. So it seems like we've gone back toward the punches now to harvest grafts. So we went from punches to strips, now back to punches. As you probably know, I'm very passionate about both technologies, both strip and FUE. I think there's an incredible role for both. And I've done a lot of videos on that. I'm going to do more videos on that as a separate topic. But to get back to the subject here, so what happened is that there's this guy, Ray Woods, in the 80s and 90s in Australia who started to say, hey, what if I harvested with punches again? But this time, instead of taking 16 to 20 hairs out, 3 to 4 follicular units, what if I actually individually took follicular units out? The problem with Ray is he's still around. He's is a very secretive guy. He never shared his technology, never shared his knowledge, and so no one really knew how he did anything. And that was, and people that he would charge a lot of money for people to go to see him. For rarely if people went to see him. So there was really no evolution of that technology. But he was really should be credited as one of the first people out there that came back and started to understand this concept again in the modern era. The seminal work that came out in 2002 was by Bernstein and Rassman, who started looking at the concept of FUE in the modern sense. But the evolution of that was that there was a high transection rate. They had what's called a Fox test, which basically looked at the fact that most grafts that were harvested, they had to look at a test to determine, the likelihood of success with harvesting, because back then the instrumentation was crude. It was like driving a Model T versus a state-of-the-art Ferrari or McLaren. And so the first major entry, pardon me if I'm getting the year wrong, but it's around 2010 or so, was the NearGraft machine that was called OmniGraft back in Europe, was from France, that came over. It employed suction to the device. It's still around. People still use NearGraft, but it's very, very, very old technology. Essentially, I'm not saying it's wrong to use it. I'm just saying it's very, very old technology, where basically it was a sharp punch to the area with some suctioning, which could desiccate the grafts when the suction is way over pulled, and so that really was around. And then there was two major camps in the early 2010s up till, I would say, 2017, which is that watershed year, which we'll talk about the big evolution. So the two camps were sharp and blunt. So the sharp punch was pioneered by a guy, John Cole. I think he's still a big advocate of it. A sharp punch had a lot of good things to it. The grafts were very clean and they came out very beautifully. However, they're very hard to control, and the transection rate was very high, because you can imagine a sharp punch going into a follicular unit would have a higher rate of transection. The other camp was pioneered by a guy, Jim Harris, out of Colorado, and essentially what Jim's big fan was the blunt punch. He called it the safe punch. The safe punch stood for surgically advanced follicular extraction, I believe. And essentially what that was using a blunt technology. And what the blunt technology is that the blunt was able to harvest more safely. So for a novice or someone starting out, it was much easier to harvest, but the grafts oftentimes were buried, which means that if you think of a blunt force on it, it pushed the grafts into the tissues and caused issues. And that's really where that was. And during the 2010-11 era, I purchased also an ARTAS, ARTAS, which is also known as the robot, which is very sexy sounding. Unfortunately, my robot is sitting right now in the closet. I actually finally moved it out. It's just really old, outdated technology. I haven't really used it in about 6 years. The robot technology sounds sexy, but it really has a lot of shortcomings, and this is why the grafts don't really look right to me. They really hurt the donor, in my opinion. They don't create good quality grafts. I haven't used it in 6 to 7 years. Essentially what the robotic technology is that it used a combination of sharp and punch, where it initially scored the skin with a sharp dissection, and then it followed it with a blunt punch. And the blunt punch came in, the sharp was to score the dermis, and we'll talk about the new evolution where Trivellini has come to incorporate some of these concepts, but in a different way. The sharp was to score the dermis, which is the tough part of the skin, the epidermis and dermis, and then the blunt punch was to cradle the grafts to minimize transection. The problem with the robot is the graft quality was not good. They could not harvest low in certain zones. And the robot really doesn't have the intellect, I hate to say, that I do in terms of decision making, because it's actually much more sophisticated than an algorithm the robot can do. So I've really not used a robot in about 7 years now. The graft qualities have really remarkably evolved in 2017. So essentially, what was this change? So first, we'll talk about the old punches were also rotational. So in other words, high-speed rotation going in, which caused torsional injury to the grafts. In other words, high speed going in there could cause damage to the grafts. Today, where the evolution 2017 is that there is something called hybrid technology and oscillation. So there's two big pioneers, Jean Devois out of Belgium and Roberto Trivellini out of Paraguay, both of whom are my friends and both of whom are featured in my textbooks. So Jean came up with something called the WOW. WOW, capital W-A-W, is actually doesn't stand for anything. It's just the sound, or like a wow machine, he calls it. And what the difference is, both these gentlemen use what's called hybrid technology. So this term, hybrid technology, basically means that it comes with the best of both worlds, a sharp and punch, sharp and blunt. So think of it like a trumpet. They've also been known as a trumpet. Think of it the face of a trumpet. The trumpet has a sharp edge, right, and it has a blunt face like a funnel. So the blunt face that comes in is cradling the graft, and the sharp edge of it on the outside actually allows the cutting, but you see it's facing away from the graft. So now that punch can come down and not transect the graft. At the same time, it can cut the skin cleanly. So this is the best of both worlds, marrying the blunt and sharp camps that were fighting each other in the 2010s. And I'll tell you a little bit difference between Trivellini and the WOW, but essentially both of them use this technology, and they both use what's called oscillation. So high-speed rotation caused torsional injury. What these geniuses did is that instead of doing high-speed rotation, these punches go down, slowly down in an oscillatory fashion. So there isn't the high-speed torsional injury, because there's heat generated by rotation and also injury to the grafts being twisted inside the coming out. Now when I look at these grafts, they look absolutely stunning. If they're harvested well, if you handle the grafts well, the harvesting well, they come out gorgeously. So this evolution is big. What's the difference between Trivellini and Devois? I actually own both machines. I own two of each ones, because just like when you're driving a Ferrari, if you're driving one, well, I guess in F1 you have to drive that car, but I have multiple cars in case one breaks down. I've got multiple ones to drive. So the Trivellini uses what's called multiphasic treatments, and actually the new Devois ones also have that as well. So what he does is, remember what I told you about the robot, which uses a sharp and then it uses a blunt. Well, these are all sharp and blunt simultaneously, but what it does is it uses the rotational speed initially to score the dermis, and then the oscillation to go down. So it still uses a rotation, but only to score the dermis before it gets down into the middle section, and then it does a rotation. Remember what I told you about the suction that the NeoGraft did, was that suctioned the graft all the way into a canister. There's been a lot of argument whether that causes over-desiccation and failure of the grafts because of this suction over a long tube. But now what the Trivellini does is that it actually just suctions enough to suction some blood. It actually pulls the graft out, but it doesn't suction the graft all the way down a long canister. So it allows the graft to be more dislodged in more atraumatic fashion. The Devois now also features these elements, but the one thing I really like about the Devois is sensitivity. So instead of having it all composed in the actual instrumentation itself, I'm using my foot, so I can actually modulate the speed. It's sort of like a car. It actually feels exactly like acceleration and letting go of the accelerator. The Trivellini is sort of an on and off device, but there are a lot of advantages to Trivellini. I use one or the other depending on the patient's anatomy. But the Devois, I love it because of the sensitivity, especially when I'm doing beard FUE harvest. I have unparalleled feeling when I'm moving it. So I can actually control the speed and slow it down, speed it up. So that's a lot of information, and I literally have written 9 textbooks on this subject, so I can go into so much detail. Even just my lecture on FUE, how to harvest, recently in Fort Lauderdale was 45 minutes long. So this video is already pretty excessively long, but I wanted to sort of give you the context of evolution of technology. So I'm not bad-mouthing robotic technology, I'm not bad-mouthing neograph technology, but I'm really telling you that where we are today are oscillatory hybrid punches, and that's why the graph quality looks so great. So when you're picking a surgeon and you're picking the team, you're also picking the technology. For me, it's very important to know what technology is being used, because these technologies out there are truly state-of-the-art. The graph quality looks nothing like what I had back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, 2010s. It's a revolution.